Activation and discretion warning. This episode contains explicit and graphic descriptions of attempted suicide, physical assault, and adult content situations, including sexual assault and rape. Discretionary caution and action is required. This episode is not for children. Please use extreme self-care in listening to this episode and seek immediate help through the National Suicide Hotline by dialing 988 if you are emotionally activated or triggered by the content of this episode. Or if you are activated and need help from the National Sexual Assault Telephone Hotline, call 1-800-656-HOPE. That's 1-800-656-4673. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast. I'm your host, Dave Markel, coming to you from the Long Valley Studio in Washington, Utah. Most of you already know the foundation of this podcast, but for those of you who are new here, I want you to know that this show serves a dual purpose. First, it provides a safe space for victims and survivors of rape or sexual assault to share their experiences to facilitate healing. Secondly, it educates listeners on the principles of a trauma-informed response, going beyond superficial understanding to foster effective advocacy and positive action. This is episode 140, and my guest this week is Violeta Bagia. Violeta reached out to me a few weeks ago via email with a gripping story of being born in Bosnia-Herzegovina, migrating with her mother to Germany, then to Australia, enduring bullying, then rape, and utilizing her amazing writing skills to both cope and eventually tell her life story. Violeta's multi-layered experiences are as intriguing as they are inspiring. Let's get to it. Here's Violeta. Violeta Bagia, it is an honor and a pleasure to have you with me today. Thank you for being here on Sexual Assault Survivor Stories.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm going to ask you, Violeta, to tell my audience how we came into contact.
I love these kind of stories because I'm a huge believer in the universe guides you in ways that can seem a little bit strange and wacky at times. But if you open yourself up and kind of read the signs and go with it, I think it usually leads you to a really cool place. For this in particular, I was actually browsing on my podcast on my phone. I usually listen to paranormal things and all sorts of wacky stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But I was feeling a little bit more grounded, let's say, this particular day. So I started browsing through what could I get out there that can help me connect with myself. So this is after I was about to start really thinking about releasing my book that I was writing. And this book was to do with my sexual assault. So I wanted to find someone that spoke about these things in a way that was comforting and in a way that shone light on the positive outcomes. So not just all the doom and gloom. So I started browsing and I Googled, and actually this is the first podcast that came up. So I clicked into it, started listening, been a listener for a while, maybe 8-9 months now.
Oh, wow.
And then I did a backload of all the episodes, basically binged within, I don't know, 3 or 4 weeks during my drives. And only a few days ago, I was like, you know what? I have the courage. I'm going to email Dave and have a chat and see if perhaps he'd be interested in sharing my story because, you know, I'm on the other side of the planet here in Australia. And in a few days we were chatting and here we are. So yeah, the universe has a funny way of guiding you. So I'm listening.
Absolutely. First of all, I want to say thank you so much for looking for this type of podcast. And then the fact that it came up as the top selection is an honor to me. I'm glad that happened and that you reached out to me. So many people have waited quite a while or just have texted me saying something like, I listened to your podcast, but I didn't know if I should reach out or not. Even though I give that invitation all the time on my podcast and in my podcast episode notes, I invite people to email me, to drop me notes, to say whatever they want to say. So when I got your email, I was just thrilled. And I did a little background research myself to find out who you were and what you were about. And first of all, your email was just so nice and said quite a bit, even though it wasn't all that long. But it inspired me to reach out to you. And I emailed Violeta right back and said, yes, we need to talk. I'd like to talk to you about being on the show. And just so my audience knows, Violeta and I have had a conversation before this. We've talked briefly on the phone. We had a great talk. And there's so many facets and layers and things going on with Violeta that I was just inspired to say, yes, right off the bat, you need to be on this show. Thank you again for joining me and for doing this. Tell us about yourself, Violeta. You've been a writer for a long time. I read a little bit about you, and you started at age 12 with a poem. And
Yes.
So kind of go from there. What inspired you? And tell us about that journey, if you don't mind.
Yeah, of course. And thank you again for having me on, because it's huge. And yeah, you are right. It can take some time to reach out, because, you think about, do I really want to talk about my story? Do I want to get it out there? And it's one thing to talk about it in the sense that I do with my writing, because in the conversation we briefly did have, I mentioned that it was a fictionalized retelling. So obviously there's parts of it that are protecting me and my heart and my soul and all those details. So having it come out in this format is vastly different, because it's the true me. It's completely open. It's raw. So there's no filtering it behind you, the tropes that you need to write to fit a certain genre for a book, for example.
Yeah.
But yeah, my origin story goes back to Yugoslavia. So I was born in Bosnia and Herzegovina. We migrated to Germany, my mum and I, when I was 4 years old, when the war broke out. My dad was in the army, so he stayed back to fight. So the time that my mum and I spent in Germany was a time of turmoil and upheaval. We, of course, had family that we were there with, which was really lovely. And I'm so glad that we did, for my mum's sake, because I couldn't imagine what she would have been going through. So having that buffer there to keep me occupied and keep me looked after, so my mum could process and potentially prepare herself for the worst news if it ever came, was a really good thing. Fortunately, though, my dad did manage to get out. He joined us in Germany a couple of months later, which was amazing. My family helped us make the big move to Australia, where we've been since. So the next part of the origin story is starting school in a brand new country, learning how to adapt to a completely different culture. It was wild, the differences between what was normal and regular in Yugoslavia and Germany even, versus here, and just the little nuances, when people had dinner and the way they had dinner and what they would call certain things. And then, of course, not having any language experience. We all came here not speaking English at all. We didn't learn English, in kinder over there or anything like that. It was literally come here, brand new country, brand new everything, and dive in head first and good luck.
Man, that's a tough way to go.
Yeah. And I guess now as an adult, I look back at it through the lens as an adult myself, and just imagine how hard it would have been for my mum and dad coming here and literally not having anything, at that age, mid to late 20s, you're kind of just starting out on your feet. You've finally got a good job. You've finally got money. You can finally start thinking about getting your own place. You've got a child now. What do we do? Where do we go? But suddenly all of that's thrown into chaos because you have to move countries. So whatever you did have is null and void. Your qualifications don't matter anymore. So you start out here and doing whatever job you can get. So most of my childhood, my parents were working multiple jobs each just to make ends meet. And we were living with a relative until we could finally move into like a little unit of our own. And that's when I first started school. So that's when I first had my experience of what it was to be completely different. And I don't think as a child I really could comprehend that in a way that made sense to me, right? Like you just don't really understand. You see how some people do things, and then you see how you do things at home, and all you can register as a child of that age, I was 5 or 6 at that time, is that you're different. And that difference led to a sense of isolation, if you will. It wasn't just the language barrier, it was the cultural barrier.
Sure, yeah.
But fortunately, there were a lot of kids who had come from similar backgrounds in that school. So it was quite a culturally diverse area that we ended up living in. So there was a sense of camaraderie in a way, which was nice. But that sense was, I guess, the isolation outweighed that, because it was still, they weren't exactly the same stories, and we still didn't speak the same language. They were from different parts of Europe. And so from there, as you said, my first writing foray came about when I was 12. And that was purely because I didn't have friends. I was isolated, and I was trying to do anything to occupy myself and stay happy and do whatever kids could do with imagination. So that led me down the route of a lot of reading. And then I started writing. My dad encouraged that writing. He saw the spark. He said, why don't you try writing stories? Why don't you try writing stories for your toys? Maybe plays for me and mum. And so I did. And yeah, by the age of 12, I think a teacher had recognized that passion as well and encouraged me to submit one of my poems to a writing competition for our local council. And I won that, got paid for it. So that made me officially a published author.
That's so cool.
Yeah, so that was the highlight. And I think that's what propelled that journey of when I grow up, I want to be a writer. I know what I'm doing now. And from there was this sense of, okay, you've achieved this one thing, but then it kind of became, as is the cultural norm in a lot of European countries, and I'm sure a lot of other nations as well, there is this sense of, okay, you've done this, but what's next? So it was just bigger and better every time. And your B grades weren't good enough. It had to be A's or A pluses. So I quickly learned how to navigate being a kid, but still doing all of this. My sister was born not long before that, so I was taking care of her also while my parents were working their jobs. So it became an interesting childhood where I was looking after my baby sister, doing schoolwork, extracurricular activities like tennis and piano, and then still trying to be a kid and do all of the things that kids would do, go to birthday parties and such. And the writing stayed close in my heart as my best friend, kept me feeling connected in a way that I didn't really feel with other kids because, again, although there were some similarities, we weren't the same. And I felt that because I had developed this almost overachiever teacher's pet type situation, I didn't really fit in with anyone else either. And that's where, sadly, all the bullying started. So early on, probably the first year of high school is when most of the bullying really kicked off because the groups segregated into the cool kids who would wag school and not go to classes. And then there was me who would be in the library at lunchtime and taking on extra assignments and things like that. Probably by the middle of that first year of high school, I started to really feel the pressures of, I didn't really look like all the other pretty girls. I had dark features, dark eyes, dark hair. Some of my skin was super tanned. Everyone else was really fair and really blonde, blue eyes. There was such a disparity there. I started to think, obviously, at that age, 12, 13 years old, as a teenage girl, you're starting to feel, look at all these boys and they don't like me. They like all these other girls. Why don't I look like that? And then is it because I'm studying too much? Is it because I'm a nerd? And then who knows, all sorts of wild and wacky things go through the teenage brain, right? Sure. From that is when I remember first starting to feel the pressures of that school life, home life, not fitting in life. And that's when I first started to self-harm. So I started to cut my wrists at that age, probably around 12 or 13. And that continued for a long time until, honestly, probably until about 5 or 6 years ago. And that's something I've not really admitted to anyone except my husband because he lives with me and he's seen it. And, I've been to therapy for it. So it took a long time to get beyond that. And it became my little comfort. It was my release. Pressure gets too much. You make a little opening and you release some of it. From there, that's how I functioned. I was able to be super high functioning, high achieving, doing inordinate amounts of work, staying on top of all my grades until the bullying got too much in 10th grade and my parents agreed to move me schools. So I started at a new school, which, at age 17, 18 is horrific to start a new high school and try to make new friends. Fortunately, the school I went to had really nice teachers and really nice students. So I felt mostly okay there. There were still some elements of people that would catch sight of my wrists and would tell me to kill myself because I was an emo and cut deeper next time and all sorts of things like that. We think back now, I'm like, who even at that age has that kind of mentality? I don't think I ever would have had such a thought in my mind to tell someone that at, age 17 or 18. So yeah, looking back at it now is just wild. From there, I remember staying in touch with some kids from my original school. And there was one guy in particular who, he showed me some attention because I was saying at that time I felt wasn't pretty like all the other girls, and all the popular guys would go for a specific type of girl, and I didn't fit that mold. So I jumped at the opportunity when he showed me this attention, and I guess I was also starved for attention at that age. We stayed in touch through my final year of high school. I started going back to the old school to hang out with them and his group of friends and see him. From there, we got into a relationship because I remember telling him, look, I'm not a kind of girl that just sleeps around with guys. Like, I want it to be a boyfriend. I want to be together. And the boyfriend I had in my new school, we broke up, and he was just lovely. He was the nicest guy, still is. We've occasionally stayed in touch. So I attribute my high expectations of men to how great he was, and my husband now. But because we broke up and I was feeling really sad, obviously, I think everyone has that emotion, especially that age. You look for the next thing to hold on to that shows you some kind of positivity. And that's where I got into the relationship with this guy from my old school. And he said all the right things, did all the right things. And I quickly realized that none of what we were doing is what I wanted to be doing. And of course, I could never attribute any kind of meaning to what was happening. All I knew is that I didn't like what it was. And I realize now in my late 30s that it was a coercive relationship, and that even the things that I considered potentially consensual then wouldn't have been, because none of it was my choice. It was coercively expressed to me in the ways that he would speak and the things he would do. Once I did realize that I didn't want to be in that relationship, I ended things. But by that point, I think I had already lost parts of myself and I didn't feel like me anymore. And that was towards the middle of my final year of high school, and I tried to take my life. So that railroaded all of my ambitions of wanting to be a writer, of wanting to go to university, of wanting to do anything really with my life. I survived, obviously. Here I am, not talking to you from the beyond. It was just a game of survival after that. It was just get up and learn to do everything again, because I didn't know where I belonged. I felt like I was living from a weird twilight zone, like I was looking at my life from the outside. It wasn't me. I felt so bad for my parents because, of course, I could never tell them why I had done this horrible thing. And they just blamed themselves, and they thought it was the pressure of school and everything like that, and could never tell them. And I think I've only told my parents in the last couple of years, and that was because this book was coming out and I kind of had to. Being a parent, I'm sure they knew something had been up, but that's my origin story.
Wow, Violeta, that's very, very sad and heartbreaking. I know that's probably not at all what you intend it to be in terms of what the listener hears. The listeners have that opportunity of relating to you and hearing some of what you've been through and saying to themselves, yes, I've either thought about that or I've done that. I know where she's at, and I have a very good understanding of where Violeta is coming from. So let me just say, from my perspective, thank you, first of all, for being brave and courageous in the trust that you've given myself and this audience to tell that story. Violeta, if you could help us understand what those coping mechanisms of self-harm felt like to you. I know you said that the pressure would build up and that was a release, that the cutting was actually a release. But there's actually much more to that whole process. There's got to be fear involved. There has to, especially those first few times. And I'm wondering if you can help us understand what that must have felt like to be so isolated, so alienated from your peers, from the people that you thought should be, friendly and kind and weren't. Can you help us understand what that initial experience is like and how that feels to then clean up and push forward and move on and then reflect on what it was that you did? How does that all fit into your daily life back then?
Yeah, so that's a great question, because I have pondered on that for a long time, especially during therapy, because bless the therapist I had most recently in the last few years, she had such a way of making you so uncomfortable but comfortable at the same time, and face things that you had really never even considered facing, because honestly it's scary, right? You don't want to go back there, because being there, it felt like you were just trudging through mud, and doesn't matter how much you push through or how much progress you make, you never really get anywhere. It's just stuck in place and the motions and going with the daily grind. Everything's moving past really fast around you, but you're just stuck. And that's what it felt like. But the first few times of that cutting experience, it almost unblocked whatever was slowing down that part of my world and allowed me to align back in time with the rest of the world and kind of get back into speed. And that's what it felt like. It felt like that pressure would build so much to a point where, you know, I didn't know if I wanted to scream or cry or sob or sleep or go running, or there was no comprehension. I couldn't compute what was going on. And I know that, you know, I'm sure there's people out there, you know, you'd squeeze your hands and feel that little, you know, that little pinch of your nails against your palms, and then you're like, oh, that kind of feels good, because it feels like something that grounds you, something that's there and present and visceral.
Right.
And that's what it was, right? I'm sure everyone has it, you know, even in times of frustration where you might grab your hair and yank a little bit too hard, and you kind of feel that little instant second of, oh, there's something there beyond the intrusive thoughts or the racing thoughts or whatever else is going on in your brain. And so that's what it felt like. It felt like, firstly, you know, that little steam hole, it would allow the pressure to come out safely and naturally without blowing up. So like a kettle, that's what I always kind of felt like I was. And then beyond that, it was that notion that whatever was holding me stuck in this mud that I couldn't push through, it would dissipate and I would be able to catch back up. And that's how I would function. I'd be able to go, you know, really high performance, high energy, high achieving for a period of time until it would all build up again. And then I would do that again. And that just became a coping mechanism. And that's what I did for years and years and years. And, you know, in terms of the cleanup, well, that became something that I got really good at. Luckily, at that time, in the 90s and the early 2000s, all sorts of, you know, ugly, gaudy, chunky bracelets were in fashion, and, you know, jumpers that had finger holes. So you could always wear something that would cover things. And I entertained the idea of a bit of the punk skater rock fashion. So that involved all those stripy fingerless gloves. So there were all sorts of things I got really creative with. And I knew that because I had recognized it in some other students around the school, and that's what they were doing. And it was unspoken, and it was something you didn't really discuss, obviously, but you caught glimpses. And somebody would go to the bathroom and wash their hands, and it would be a sports day at school, and you'd be in the change rooms and you'd see someone take off their jumper and you'd see the scars there. So there were other people. I definitely recognized that, and I remember it well. I think that's just how we all functioned. Sadly, that's what worked for me, and it worked for me for a long time until that final point where even that wasn't helping. That's where I made that decision to try and take my life.
I am so sorry for the experiences that you've had in your life that, first of all, even drew you to the self-harm, but then to reach that point of making that decision, I'm ready to end it all. This is it. I'm done. Are you able to tell us more about that experience and how it ended in terms of the fact that you weren't successful? Thankfully, I have to tell you from the bottom of my heart, thankfully, I'm glad, so glad you're here talking to me.
Oh, likewise, I'm glad to.
Are you able to tell us more about that experience?
Yeah, so I remember it well. I was sitting at home. It's one of these things where you read on the internet and there's memes, and, you know, thankfully there's so much dialogue now about this, which is really great because, you know, people need to speak up and hear the ugly stories and the scary stories, because it might connect with somebody and help them in a way that a gentler way might not have worked, right? So for me, I remember sitting at home and it was just a normal day. There wasn't any overly nostalgic or sad moments. I wasn't moody or miserable. It was normal. My parents went to work. My sister was at school. I hadn't gone to school. Can't remember why. I don't know if it was that I wasn't feeling well or if there was like a teacher day or something like that where their students were at school. But I hadn't gone to school and I had been taking antidepressant medication for a few years at this point, thanks to my psychiatrist. So that's what I chose. That was my tool of choice. I took the entire packet of that. I had a little dog at the time, and I knew that if anybody came in or if the ambulance came, or I had thought ahead of everything. So I didn't want my dog to go ballistic. I didn't want anyone to have to harm my dog to get rid of him, if they happened to come through the front door. So I remember locking my dog away to make sure he was safe in case anyone did come. And I sent off a message to a few good friends, and one of them is who is my husband now. So it was just a few messages saying thank you for being, the good people in my life and all of that. So there was that stereotypical goodbye message, I guess, if you want to call it that. As the medication took hold and I sort of started feeling that wave of your life leaving your body, everything starts to go first, your arms get heavy, your body gets heavy. There was a moment where something in my brain ticked over and said, this is not what we want to be doing. And it was such a sharp, strong jolt that it overrode everything that was happening to my body physically, that I managed to pick up my phone and I called the ambulance. I called them there and I said, this is what I've done. This is what I've taken. This is the milligrams. This is how many. So again, I had enough cognition to know everything, all the data that somebody might need. So I don't know whether that was subconsciously my brain already making plans for aborting the mission, so to speak, or if it was just at that time, like I said, it overrode everything that had been happening. And I don't remember the ambulance coming. I don't remember them coming through the door. I remember waking up in the ambulance at one point. The lady, like the nurse or the ambulance driver or somebody in there, don't even remember who it was, but somebody asking who they wanted me to call. And I remember saying to call my mum, and I don't even know what job she was at the time, but, they called my mum, then they called my dad. And then I remember waking up in the hospital at some point, whether it was that day or the next day, I'm not quite sure. And one memory I do have, and it's one thing I've only shared with my husband, was I had a lanyard with a key ring and it was a little soccer ball because I loved soccer and I loved this team, who, funnily enough, actually lost the grand final last night. So that's not great timing for this story. But, they're usually a great team. So I always had this little soccer ball. And I remember being so upset because the first memory I had of waking up in the hospital was that my key ring was gone. The little soccer ball was gone. Actually, recently, when I released the book, my husband, he gave me a gift and it was the same soccer ball key ring. And it was the most heartwarming thing I've ever received. So, So we've come full circle, right?
That's awesome. I love that. Violeta, all the things that would lead up to that kind of a decision, to me, the fact that there was a rape contributing to that makes a whole lot of sense to me. In fact, I have colleagues that I've talked to, especially in the military where I worked for a while, that the suicide rate being so high, our logical conclusion was that because there was such a high prevalence of rape and sexual assault within the military, that had to have had a part in those decisions to end one's life. And I know that is a huge aspect of suicide in many cases. Are you able to tell us more about your sexual assault and rape experiences in that sense of being manipulated, being coerced, and how that impacted you in so many ways? Did it have that impact of being a contributor to your decision to try and end your life?
Yeah, I think after a lot of soul searching and a lot of therapy, the conclusion that I came to was that the way that the relationship had gone and the way that I had been broken down into a malleable piece of something, it was beyond me just saying I didn't know who I was. I felt like I was nothing. It wasn't even a person anymore, right? What was left felt like it was just a malleable piece of something that bended and molded to the will of this person because of the way that he spoke and the things he said and the manipulation. He was your typical alpha male. He had a group of friends that did anything that he would say, and If they ever got into trouble for anything, he would abandon them all at the drop of a dime because it was just about protecting himself. He would say all the right things, so like, but you like me. This is what people do. What do you mean? I thought we're having a good time. You're the one who came here. All of those sorts of things. And yet it was that. It was true. I did go there and I continued to go there. And like I said, it was a relationship. It was several weeks. And over the course of those weeks, every single time that we were together, I remember feeling, because like I said, I had a relationship before. I had a boyfriend before and he was amazing. And even when that ended, I still felt like, oh, that's sad. But I never felt, wow, that was awful. What is life? Like it was just a normal relationship with a normal breakup. And that's why I think it just did not compute in my brain, because I'd had a relationship and I'd had a breakup and I'd felt the sadness of it, but it didn't feel like this. So I think in my brain, there was always this disconnect between, but he's saying all these nice things and he's not doing anything overly violent. So surely it's not anything to do with rape or sexual assault, right? And that's how I justified it in my brain. And so every time it was almost as if, as a person, a curious person, I kept going back to see, maybe it's different this time. No, maybe we're a little bit not understanding what's going. Let's try again, right?
Yeah.
And in my brain, I couldn't compute because there were all these nice things that were being said to me and spoken to me, yet inside I felt completely hollow and completely disconnected, as if I was watching everything from outside. It wasn't me there. It was almost as if the entire thing was happening to me and I was just observing. And that's predominantly what led to the suicide attempt, because it felt as though over that duration of the few weeks that we were together, it was such a slow and meticulous breakdown of who I was and who I had been, that at the end of it, there was nothing left of me. I just couldn't recognize who I had been. Things didn't matter. I didn't feel the same way about my passions. I stopped writing. I stopped reading. School didn't matter. My grades flunked so dramatically that my teachers were saying, you are literally not going to pass high school. Like there is just no chance at this point. And I couldn't salvage any of it. That to me was probably the biggest shock, because here I was, this person who had been receiving ducks. I had been receiving straight A's. I had been doing extracurricular activities. I'd done work with the Australian government for the youth consulate. I was soaring, right? I had ambitions. I was going places. I was doing things. I had goals. I had a little sister and I had great parents, and we'd survived war and we'd come to Australia with this great life. And yet here I was feeling like this useless, nothing existence. And it was honestly because the parts of me that had been me just didn't exist anymore. And I think that part, after, like I said, after a lot of therapy and a lot of soul searching, it was that notion of I had completely lost myself and I couldn't see any way to bring that person back. The realization of, well, I think that person is gone completely. That's it. There's nothing left. So what is there left to come back to? There is nothing to come back to. It's gone. Recently, when I got back in touch with him, because I needed to for myself, because evidently my misery hadn't been enough for the last 20 years, I had to reach out to him and further that agony. He was cruel, of course, but the one thing he said that really kind of cemented my entire, because the entire time, Dave, the entire time, even until now, speaking now, I was like, maybe I was the problem, right? Maybe I was overreacting or thinking all these things, and he was actually a great person. But no, you know what? The one thing he said to me, and then I had the absolute pleasure of speaking to some people that knew him really well, and they confirmed that actually he was the type of person that I imagined he was. And so I wasn't imagining things. But he said to me, if it was so bad, why did you keep coming back? And that cemented everything to me. So I was like, okay, I'm like, that's literally the playbook number one line of people that do these types of things. So I knew everything I needed to know at that point, and that was all the closure I needed.
Yeah, absolutely. Wow, Violeta, it's amazing that you had that internal drive to want to reach out to him, but I understand that in terms of that closure aspect of it, and am I right, and all these thought processes leading up to reaching out and then getting that confirmation. But going back, I'm curious, as this self that you were feeling being stripped away, did you recognize it then? I know you just said, yeah, I felt myself being stripped away, but did you recognize that stripping away of who you were as being so connected to that manipulation, that coercion, and that relationship? Or was it a conglomeration of a whole lot of other things that were going on even outside of that physical relationship with him?
Honestly, I can't answer that because I really don't know. I feel, if I'm to be completely honest, it feels that yes, it was purely because of that relationship, because everything else to that point, including all the home stresses of just home life, right? Everyone's got a stressful home life. That's life. I was managing all that. I was managing all my homework. I was managing the other activities. I was managing being bullied and all of that jazz. I was managing all that. So what was outside of that data set? It was this relationship.
Sure.
So I knew that there was a direct correlation there for me, but I didn't know why. And I think that's where that confusion arose, because I couldn't assign a word to it. I couldn't assign a meaning to it. All I knew was that this didn't feel right, and you're not meant to feel disgusting and gross and broken after leaving somebody that you're in a relationship with, right? Like when you go home, you shouldn't be thinking, wow, I'm glad to be home. You should be thinking, can't wait to go there the next day or see them again. What really drove that home for me then, and this again was after a lot of soul searching in the last 2 or 3 years, was, so my parents always taught me, doesn't matter how terrible a relationship ends or a friendship, or everyone deserves a conversation, right? Give them the chance to have a conversation, share their side of the story. Don't do things via email or text, be civilized, right? So my parents always taught me this. There was a moment where I think, right sort of before the suicide attempt, there was a moment where I was, you know what, I don't think I want to go back and see this guy again. And I had this moment, this thought. And as I was having that thought, I was on my way to a friend's house. And at this stage, I was working with this friend at one of my casual jobs. And he had another friend over. So the three of us were sitting there just playing, I think we were playing Pokemon cards at that time. Like we were just sitting on the bed playing Pokemon cards. And I said to them both, like, look, I think I'm going to break up with this guy. And they were both really supportive. They're like, sure, what do you want to do? I'm like, I'm just going to text him because I can't even go there. And they both looked at me like I had grown a second head, because that's outside of the data set for me. That's not something I would ever do.
Right.
But neither of them questioned it. They're like, okay, yep, that's cool. Like, here's your phone, go for it. So I did it, shot off a quick message and just like threw my phone. I felt sick. I couldn't even look at it. And I knew at that point, the fact that I had gone outside of what's my norm to do something like that, because I just could not fathom seeing this person again, it drove home to me that, okay, like maybe there is something a little bit more sinister there that even I'm not computing at this point. And then the real nail in the coffin there was a few days after that, he had, after sending off a bunch of messages back to me about, breaking up and whatever, I don't even remember. It wasn't nice, it wasn't amicable. He had left some things in the boot of my car. And I knew that I needed to return them because A, I didn't want them in there. I don't want to look at that. Yeah. And then B, it's not in my repertoire to just throw out people's possessions because, we came to Australia, had nothing. So I knew the value of things, right? Like, there's no way I'm going to do that, even if I don't want to see this person. So I asked my friend, I said, look, I need you to come with me. I've got some stuff. I need to bring it back to this guy. I don't want to go by myself. Don't feel really comfortable doing that. Can you come? And then we can go and have lunch or something together. Unbeknownst to me, this guy ended up being my husband now, which is great. But even he, when he came with me to drop this stuff off, even he was like, wow, that guy's a piece of work. I'm like, yeah, right. And that was it. We never spoke about it again and never jerried, never crossed my mind. Just kind of left it like that. And I started to kind of feel a little bit more, okay, I kind of feel like I'm semi myself again. But then, going back to school and seeing how, like, there was no salvaging any of my school. There was no salvaging anything that I had wanted to do or achieve because of how quickly everything had gone down the toilet, basically. Yeah. That's, where it led to the point where it's like that. It's like, okay, I've ended this one thing, but it hasn't fixed anything and there's nothing to fix now. And that was it.
It's amazing to me as you talk to listen to that comprehensive idiosyncratic process that you went through in realizing certain aspects of it, understanding some of it, not understanding other parts of it, but knowing that it was still wrong, that it was affecting you and impacting you. I think those psychophysiological aspects of rape and sexual assault are so entwined in our lives because of what intimacy is built on and what our
Mm-hmm.
self-worth is built on, that it really sheds light on other people who are struggling with trying to figure out what it is they went through, because you've had this reflective time and really good therapy, it sounds like, which congratulations. I'm really happy that that happened for
Thank
you,
you.
that you're able to talk to it and talk to us as you are. It's so insightful and so helpful. And I appreciate your trust in talking about these things, because I just know there are people in this audience who are hearing this who are going to directly relate and obtain a level of understanding and healing from the things that you're talking about. So thank you for doing this. I just had to interject that. I also want to interject how sorry I am, not only for all of the cutting, the suicide attempt, but what led up to it. I'm very sorry and sad that you experienced that type of interpersonal relationship with him that led to that. I'm sorry for your experiences, but at the same time, and I've said this to other guests, I'm so thankful that you have taken that and turned it into something that has built you up, that has then edified you in your ongoing career, in your relationship with your husband. And I know you have a child, am I right?
Yeah.
And so that too, I know, is probably flourishing because of these experiences that you've had, that you've overcome and that you've worked yourself through, and can look back on and say, yeah, that's who I was. It's not who I am. And
Yeah.
this is what the result of that is. Are you able to talk to us then about some of the impacts that inevitably come from those types of relationship that turn inward? The things that you mentioned, the self-blame, the self-wondering, and even the shame. Talk to us, if you could, about coming out of that shame. There are so many positive things going on with you right now that I think are a direct result of your resilience, your strength, your therapy, your willingness to push forward. Talk to us about that if you could.
Yeah, I think for me, it came to a head over COVID, actually. I think a lot of great things happened over COVID for me, funnily enough. I'll just start by giving a bit of background about my writing, because it does directly link into this. Most of the books that I write entail most of the same sort of themes, because I like to explore the human condition and how people process and go through the motions of experiencing trauma, whatever that may look like. And so most of my books take me on a journey that takes about, I don't know, 6 to 8 months or maybe a bit longer to write. The first one obviously took forever because it's the first book and a lot of imposter syndrome. This book, though, the one that I wrote, the fictionalized retelling of this story, took me 28 days over COVID. I woke up one morning and it was this notion, and I couldn't think around it. I couldn't sleep because it was there. I couldn't eat without thinking about it, and it just consumed me, took on a life of its own. I started writing, and it was as though the character Andrea Nekic, she took over and she's like, we are writing this story. We're going to write it now and it's going to be great. And so I did. I gave myself over to doing all that. But in doing so, it also unlocked a lot of those core memories that had been there for a long time. And that's where those really deep inner musings came out, because I had never actually even spoken about this event to anyone. Everyone that knows me knows there was a suicide attempt, right? I've never hidden that. I've never been shy about talking about it, because I'm very much about, I'm not here to make you comfortable. I'm here to make you think. And that's my mantra, and that's how I live. Some people like it, some people don't. It's just me, and I've been unapologetic about it. For me, there was a moment where one of my girlfriends and I, we were leaving work on a Friday night, had some drinks, and we were catching a train or waiting to catch a train from the city back home. That was the first time I actually ever told anyone this story and what had happened. And I assigned the rape word to it, because in my brain, the entire time, I had never once ever thought that that's what it was, because all the literature that we've been shown and given and taught was rape happens in dark alleyways. It happens with strangers in the street, or when you don't protect your drink at the bar. It's not in relationships. It's not by boyfriends. It's not by people who are your shining A-grade students and things like that, right? So there was never that connection for me. And the moment that I made that connection on that train platform, and I wrote her a little acknowledgement in the back of the book, because it was such a profound moment for me, because that's when I shedded that image of holding that self-shame, because for me that's what it was. It was shame, because it's like he said, Why'd you keep coming back if it was so bad? And exactly, why did I keep going back? So clearly you're the idiot here. You're the one who kept going there. You had every chance to say no or push him away, but instead you did nothing. You just stayed there, which I learned later on in therapy that, instead of just fight and flight, there's also fawn. And that was where I existed. And I learned that in so many facets of my life, that I fawn a lot, because it's easier than having a confrontation. It's easier than arguing. It's easier than displeasing someone, hence the people pleasing aspect of my personality. So suddenly all these facets started to make sense, and I understood who I was as a person. It only took me, 35 years to do that, but here we are. And that was so profound, because it allowed me to actually understand that actually this wasn't right and it shouldn't have happened. And there are different ways to say no. It's not just about literally pushing someone off you or screaming or crying or sobbing. It's in not being engaged in a kiss or turning your face away, or not wanting to touch someone when they're trying to hug you or fondle you, right? There's so many ways, and the person needs to also be checking in, and it's not just on you as your responsibility. And that's where all of those little pieces of that puzzle started to click in my mind and make sense. And I realized actually that's what this was. And then, like how I came across your podcast, it was just a random moment of, I'm going to Google something and see. I typed in literally kind of very similar to what had happened to me. And the first thing that popped up was coercive consent, coercive control, coercive relationships. I was like, what is this word? Obviously, I know what it means, but what does it mean in context of a relationship and a story like this? And that's when I started to research and read. And the more I did, the more I realized how not okay I was. And all of that kind of depression and anxiety and everything I had thought I had packed away and been living without hit me like a freight train. Probably in the last, so I think my daughter would have been 5 or 6 months at that point. I had a moment where I started to feel so unbelievably close to that horrible sensation of how it felt when I had absolutely no light left in me. And I knew at that point, if I didn't literally get help that day, that I don't know how to get out of this. And I know myself well enough to know that this is where this is leading. And I didn't want to go there, right? I'd done so well to not be there. I'd done so well to go back to school as an adult and get my degrees and, start writing and do all this. I did all these things for myself. And I said, how dare you be still controlling my life like this? And I refused. So I called my GP straight away. I was like, look, I need a psychologist. I need you to send me someone immediately. Like, this is critical. I need help now. Within the week, it was amazing. She had found a spot for me and I started going. The first thing she said to me that I think I needed to hear my entire life after that event was, it's not your fault. That's all I needed to hear. And it just progressively got better from there. I graduated therapy about 5 months ago. So that was amazing. So yeah, so she was great.
That is amazing. Just the way you've articulated all of this, I think part of it has to do with the fact that you are amazing with words, makes you a good writer. But then to be able to take such personal and deeply effective aspects of your life and be able to sit here in front of a microphone and an audience of literally thousands, but still be able to say, this is who I was, this is what I went through, this is where I'm at, is to me so commendable and so brave. I can't emphasize it enough. Help us understand what your coping mechanisms are now and how you stay motivated.
I love that question because my therapist will be so proud, because I know she'll definitely listen to this. She taught me some incredible coping strategies and mechanisms, which are so simple when you really pare it back, but so effective, because you're right, there are so many physiological effects as well as memories crop up. And I think part of that had always been, and I'm sure with your background, when you speak to people as witnesses as well, there are memories that come back and people question, am I remembering this right? Mm-hmm. Why can I only get fragments? Why are other fragments coming to me in the next couple of days or years or months later, right? Yep. Because that's just the way the brain works, and It blocks things off in order to protect you and allow you to function in the moment or in the time. Yeah. And only when you're ready, when you're at a place where your brain is able to compute, it starts to come back. And that's the most incredible thing about the human brain. And I love it. I love knowing all of this because it helps me stay informed and in control. And the one thing that she has taught me is these memories will keep cropping up, and different parts of the event or the experiences or that time period will keep coming. But the important thing is to sit with them and not run from them. And that's what I had been doing in the past. The second the uncomfortable thought would come, I would quite literally get up and go and do something else. Anything, as long as it was physical. So connecting my hands and my mind. I would go and wash the dishes, go vacuum, go plant, go dig a hole, like literally anything that I could do that would cause me to run away from the thought and the feeling. Sadly, I couldn't do that any longer when I was writing this book because, well, literally, I had to sit there and write the things that had happened because that's what I was doing. I was writing a story. So I had to write them. I had to sit with them. But then it was the coping strategy of, okay, well, now you've written them. How long is this going to wipe you out emotionally? And in the beginning, when I did start writing, I remember after every single redraft and every single edit, I would be wiped out for weeks and weeks and weeks. I would still function because I had to. I have a child. I had to be a wife. I'm a full-time mum, stay-at-home mum. So I had to be the wife, the mum, run the household, do all the things and still write, still have my obligations to my publishers. And, it just wasn't sustainable. I couldn't function where weeks would be written off from me and then say to my publisher, hey, I'll be back with you shortly once my meltdown is over. Like that wasn't feasible. And so the mechanisms and the strategies I had were sit with the thought, sit with the emotion, feel it all, and then if you have to, write it out. That way it was doing two things. It was that hand and mind connection. So I was still doing the thing that I was doing before, but instead of running from it, I was expelling it onto paper. And that's how she put it for me because she knows I'm a big fan of horror movies and all sorts of things. So she was like, you're expelling it. You're expelling it out of your system. So get it on the page. I started to quickly visualize it that way. It was no longer in my brain. It was now on the paper and it was safe in the little book. And I would close the book and that was it, right? It was done. I allowed my moment to sit there and think about it and feel it. I'd allow myself a bit of misery because everyone needs that. And now the second the thought forms, it doesn't wipe me out anymore. It's a quick, fleeting 3 or 4, 5 seconds even of, that felt terrible. But also I remember all of the things that she said, and I remember all of the literature that I have read over the years and the education I've given myself now about what these relationships were and look like. And I know now, I can hand on heart say, no, it wasn't my fault. I'm the victim here, not you. I don't care how you sleep at night. I don't care if you feel like your life is ruined by me reaching out to you because you did this yourself. You're the one who chose to do this. These are your actions. I'm living with the consequences. So if I can move on past this, that's really the only thing that matters at this point. I've grieved long enough for my life. I've been miserable long enough, and I'm not allowing it to be controlling me in that way anymore. And that's what I do now. I sit there and I let the thoughts and the feelings compute within my mind. And sometimes it's anger, sometimes it's, resilience, sometimes it's rage, sometimes it's not really much of anything. It's just there and then it's gone. And that's the way that I process it now. But I definitely don't run from it anymore. And I think that's what the biggest change for me has been, is facing it head on.
That's awesome. Thank you for sharing that. It's very insightful.
Oh, thank you.
I want my audience to know more about your writing, and I want to promote your latest book as well as some of your other writings. You told me in our previous conversation off air that you had written 18 books. How many of those have been published? And can you tell me about the books you're most proud of and the ones that you really want to promote to my audience?
Sure. So without boring you about the entire long history of my publication, my publication woes, I'll give you the quick rundown.
Sure.
So I've written 18. 10 of those have been published to date, both traditionally and independently. And I will give you a little breakdown of that because it does matter in terms of where the stories have gone. The first series that I wrote was fundamentally around PTSD of soldiers coming back from war and trying to reintegrate back into life, and how those horrors of war persist even in the daily livings. And the reason I wrote these stories is because it was a little ode to my dad, because I know that what he went through, even if he's never spoken about it and never gone out of his way to tell us about it, I know that he would have suffered and potentially still does, because how could you not?
Yeah.
So I wrote those for my dad. Those stories, they deal with all sorts of PTSD within different characters, and they're all personified in different things that everyone will relate to in some way, shape, or form. Those were originally published many years back. They were my first series. And then I reverted the rights back to me once they had expired, and then I self-published them with a new take on the characters. But most recently, one of my publishers that hadn't even seen the project, haven't even read it, but they took on all 5 books and signed me on for a 5-book deal because they liked my previous writing. Wow. So that was huge.
Yeah, congrats.
And we've been re-releasing all of those steadily. So the second one is due out on the 3rd of June. And that is probably one of my proudest books, aside from Andrea Netkic is Not Fine, because it was my first book. It was my first foray into taking back control of my life and saying, you know, I've always wanted to be a writer. It's time to do that now. And so I did. And that was the first book I wrote and the first book I managed to sign a publishing deal for. That's why I'm so proud of that book. And that holds a really special place in my heart and always will for that reason alone. But Andrea Netkic is Not Fine is incredibly personal and powerful and a huge passion project for me, not only because it was my therapy to myself, but it's also my message to other survivors and other people who haven't even acknowledged what they had gone through, like I hadn't for so long. And it's maybe a hug, maybe it's a friend if they're feeling lonely or isolated. Maybe it can be a comfort, something to pick up and, you know, reread parts of the book that Andrea's been going through, some stuff that maybe they're going through, and say, hey, this is what she's done, but look at the end of the book, there's a happy ending. And that's why that book is really special to me, obviously.
I'm going to ask you to send me all of the links and connections and titles that you want me to include in the notes for this episode, because I want to make sure everybody has access to all of that and that people start reading your stuff. And I'm looking forward to doing the same. I haven't had that opportunity yet, but I will. But I definitely want to and will. Violeta, I can't thank you enough. This has just been so enlightening and so helpful and so amazing to have had this opportunity to sit with you and hear about your experience. Please join me again in the future. It would be great to have you back.
Well, thank you so much, Dave. It's been an absolute honor, and I hope that, this message receives whoever needs to hear it.
We'll talk again soon.
Absolutely.
That does it for another episode of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast. I want to extend a sincere and deeply grateful thank you to Violeta Bagia for joining us today and sharing her gripping and inspirational story. Violeta, your contribution to this show is truly appreciated, and we're honored to have had you as a guest. Thank you for reaching out to me and sharing your powerful story of endurance and resilience. You're a true powerhouse, an amazing author, and an incredible guest. For my listeners, my call to action this week is for you to share this episode with everyone in your circle of influence. And be sure to buy and read Violeta's memoir, Andrea Netkic is Not Fine. You can find it on Amazon. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to this podcast on your favorite platform, give the show a 5-star rating, and become a follower of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories on Instagram. All of these help spread the message of bringing justice to victims and survivors of rape and sexual assault. Another great way to do this is to start by believing whenever you hear a victim of rape or sexual assault tell their story, because we all know someone whose life has been impacted by rape or sexual assault. Be sure to join me next week for another powerful episode of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast. We'll see you next week.